Okay, we're starting. So, we are wrapping up our study of the prophets. We have gone through, although we kind of skipped one, although we've done it in the past, we've gone through 11 of them, which means we've got one last one. We should know who the last one is. I mean, it's the only one that's not colored in. I mean, I don't know how much more suspenseful this can be. It's Malachi. The last one. He's the last one for a reason. He's at the very, very end. The one that you always skip over because you just turn the page and just ignore him. Poor Malachi. So we've gone through the 8th century prophets. We got Jonah and Amos, Hosea, Micah. We had our 7th century prophets. We had Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Obadiah. We had our post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, and now Malachi. Oh boy, this has been a journey. This has been a lot of fun. At least I think it's been fun. So, it begins an oracle, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. And that's all we get. That is all she wrote, or he wrote. So, of course, the question is, who is this Malachi? And the answer that has been perpetuated now for over 2 millennia is we have absolutely no idea. We do not know. There is nothing. And it doesn't help that his name itself is rather confusing. It is not a typical Hebrew name. It's not how we would normally spell it. It's not how we would normally pronounce it. It seems rather odd. Now, we can break down names and like Abram, right? Father, great father, Abraham, father of many. So the names in the Old Testament tend to have meanings upon meanings and so on. And we got to be careful before we start reading too much into it. But something that people like to talk about is malak is the word for messenger. It's also the word for angel. And then the E on the end is possessive. So it's my messenger. So could this be a title of some sort? Could this be some sort of pseudonym? A prophet who is hiding his real name. These are theories. We have no idea. Of course, how on earth could we possibly know? Could this just be a guy named Malachi? I don't know. It's possible. And yes, that was a joke, Malachi. And there have been some suggestions that this is a book composed of multiple authors, who's kind of all crammed together. I don't know how widespread that's accepted. I think some have argued that Ezra himself wrote this book, which is interesting. We are going to go with the tradition that this is a prophet, one prophet. He wrote the book. Whether or not his name was Malachi or he just went by Malachi, some kind of nickname or pen name, there's just no way of knowing. Now comes the dating. And I'm going to have a tad bit of a confession, because for all the prophets, now as I've said over and over and over again, 10 of the prophets are pretty well established, at least among conservative evangelical traditions. We just accept where they are based on either what the book tells us or what we can kind of pin together based on what's in it. And of course, the 2 books that are the most problematic are Obadiah and Joel. But I have my opinions, and of course, they're right. However, when it comes to Malachi, I'm honestly not sure where he should be placed. Now, the tradition has always been he's at the end. He's the last one. I'm not disputing that. But we're going to get to the problem of it. So there's all kinds of commentaries that have argued and talked about who this is. Problems with the name, problems with writing, and so on. But we place him at the end. And the reason why we place him at the end, why we don't really even question this, is that great argument, as Tevye famously said, tradition. We just accept this on tradition. It's part of Jewish tradition, it's part of Christian tradition, and we just accept. This is where Malachi should go. But just because we know where Malachi should go doesn't mean we necessarily can pinpoint when he is writing. I'm going to explain what that means. So according to the tradition, he was a member of the great synagogue that was established maybe during the time of Haggai and Zechariah. Ezra was a part of the great synagogue. Supposedly, according to Jewish tradition, this is the synagogue that helped kind of canonize the Old Testament as we know it. So this was like a group of scribes, Pharisees, whatever, post-Second Temple, right? Temple's been made, and so now you've got a bunch of gatekeepers, right? Scribes, teachers of the law, maybe the forerunners of what we know of in the New Testament with all the Pharisees and so on. So this is the Great Synagogue. Again, post-Babylonian exile. So he was a member. And then when it comes to the book, right, Malachi's book, he's dealing with a lot of issues that Joel's dealing a lot of issues with that Ezra is dealing with. And so we agree that he belongs to mid-5th century. Right, he's post-Second Temple. That's not a question. And I'm showing you these slides because these are just commentaries, and they all kind of say the same thing. They go through the arguments and all through the issues. But what it really boils down to, and why it's a little hard to pinpoint when this book is written, and it's going to make sense, I promise you. In 538, you have the first wave of return that Haggai and Zechariah are a part of, and this was led by Zerubbabel. We should kind of remember that name. And he returns with Sheshbazzar. He's the one who brought back all the ornaments of the temple, and Joshua and all that. They're all mentioned and listed in Ezra. So this is that first wave. Haggai and Zechariah come with them. They're the ones who rebuild the temple. Okay. Then we have the second wave of return. That's in 558. So not quite 100 years, right? So 538 and then 458. My dyslexia is kicking in. So in 458, that's when Ezra comes back. Okay. So the question is, now Haggai, Zechariah, they're writing right after that first wave of return. They're writing leading up to the building of the temple. And as I've argued, Joel is somewhere right after the temple has been built. He's like that next generation. The question about Malachi, and I know that probably some of you just don't care, but it is important. The question about Malachi is he writing before Ezra shows up? Is he writing during Ezra? So while Ezra is cleaning house, basically, his reforms, what we call it. Or is he writing after Ezra? So has Ezra's reform started? Have they started, or are we past that? And the amount of fighting is just endless. The safe argument, and the one that most commentary scholars just defer to, is that he is pre-Ezra. And now you may wonder, so we know, for example, like in Malachi 1:10, I wish one of you would shut the temple doors. We know he's writing after the temple has been completed. Right? That's not a question. So he's post-Haggai, Zechariah. As you can see, in my consistent timeline, this is where I put him. Right? We have Joel, and then we have Malachi somewhere in the mid-5th century. So the real issue is, why do we think he's writing before Ezra? And silence. The argument is, if he was writing during Ezra, why doesn't he mention Ezra? So, as I'm going to say, and this is something that I'm quite proud of, you won't get the reference, but that's fine. There's something called the argument out of silence. Just because there's an absence of evidence doesn't mean there's evidence of absence. This is a philosophical fallacy. So just because as we apply here, just because Malachi doesn't mention Ezra doesn't mean Ezra isn't alive. That's not a proof. That just means we don't know. So could Ezra be there and he just doesn't mention Ezra? Yes, that's possible. Could he be writing after Ezra? That is possible, and there are scholars who accept that. Something that, and I've slowly argued myself out of this position, because when I started and my first looking into it, I just kind of accepted, well, yeah, he's probably writing before Ezra. That just makes the most sense. But I've slowly talked myself out of this position, because there's something very satisfying about the thought of that first wave comes back to the land, they rebuild the temple, and then you get Haggai and Zechariah, especially Zechariah, who seems very excited, and he's talking about how the priests are coming back and everything's going to be great, and he's anticipating this great revival now that the temple has been rebuilt. We know there's no revival, because then Joel shows up and he's complaining about how the priests aren't doing their job. That's why, again, I put Joel after Zechariah. So then Ezra shows up. He rebuilds the wall. He cleans house himself, and he sets in his reforms. So now we would expect that revival that Zechariah talked about to come after Ezra. Then Malachi shows up and says there's still no revival. That's very satisfying to me. Is it what happened? I don't know. I can't prove it. But we will kind of go through, and I'll point to this one particular verse that kind of makes it hard for that to be the case, but as we'll go through. So it doesn't really matter in the long run. All we know is he's writing around Ezra. He's either writing right before Ezra shows up, or he's most likely writing right after Ezra. So which is it? Again, I don't know. But he's the last prophet. He's writing after Joel. And this is, as you can see here, in my relative timeline, which I think is a tad more reliable, you can see Joel, right, he's at the very beginning of the 5th century, right after Zechariah, and then somewhere after Joel. Exactly like what decade, I'm not really sure. Before Ezra, after Ezra, I don't really know, but sometime shortly after Joel is Malachi. So that's where we are. So he is part of our end timers, right? We're talking about the end of times, and we're dealing with the kind of last issues. We had Joel last time. We're now dealing with Malachi. And for those who remember, and with Joel, we have his kind of main thing, his main theme is the day of the Lord. Talk about the great and terrible day of the Lord, the final day of the Lord. But Malachi, and this is one of my favorite topics, he's about the fear of the Lord. And this is something that we've seen referenced in passing, but hasn't really been a major topic until now. And for my personal theology, it seems rather interesting, that this hasn't been a major theme, but we're ending on it. So Malachi is going to end on the fear of the Lord, which seems to give it some significance. Of all the themes we've talked about, this is the one that we're going to conclude with. And again, Malachi is the last prophet. That's not up for debate, right? We can argue about Joel and so on, but Malachi, this is how we are ending. In fact, our Bibles end with Malachi. So here's our big picture timeline. You can see I've got Malachi kind of out there on his own. Where exactly he should go after Joel, again, is up for debate, but he's somewhere after Joel. Now, for those who remember, we have gone through Malachi before. That was over a year ago, but we it was a little broad, and we didn't get into as many details as we could have. So we're going to go through it again, and this time we're going to take our time a little slower. The last time we did it in 2 sessions. We're going to do this one in 3 sessions. So we'll have a little bit more depth to it. Take a little more, go a little slower. For those who remember or don't remember, I don't know, the structure is pretty established. There's not a whole lot to argue with. This seems like what most commentaries agree on. Malachi is structured around 6 oracles. And each oracle has a different theme, a different have leading topic. And the oracles are kind of introduced or centered around a question. Some have 2 questions, as you can see. So there's 6 oracles, 10 questions, and then we've got kind of these little sermonettes about the various oracles dealing with these questions. So as we go through, we're going to deal with all of this. And the way I've divided it up, which seems a little more lax, I'll say, we can take our time, is we're going to do 2 oracles a session. So tonight, we'll deal with his first 2 oracles. So oracle 1 is God's love. It'll be about the first 5 verses. So it begins, an oracle, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. And then we get our first question. I have loved you, says the Lord. So we begin with this issue of love, right? I have loved you. That's how I think most translations go with it. Now, as we know, the theme of intimacy, the theme of God's affection for Israel has already been talked about. It was introduced in Amos. The book that really explores this is a major theme, a major topic, is Hosea. I mean, the whole book is built around God's covenant affection for Israel. But even Joel talks about God knowing and caring for Israel. So it's not exclusive to Hosea, but again, that's kind of the main book. We've already covered that. Now, in order to deal with this question, we have to deal with everyone's favorite topic. I know, you're just all excited, you're all gleeful, and that is grammar. Don't we all love grammar? Yes. Yes, of course we do. And when dealing with Hebrew grammar, and this is I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before. In fact, these are slides I've reused, and we've covered this book before. But something that you probably don't think about too much is that different languages deal with verbiage differently. Specifically, the idea of time. And there's a whole field of study that how we think of time is almost certainly linked to the way we speak, the way we frame it in, that language helps us think of abstract reality. Again, that's a little deep, but the question is, when it comes to verbs in Hebrew, are we expressing what's known as time, past, present, future, or are we expressing perfection? So, for example, when we're talking about the past, so in English, we frame things as either past actions or future actions, right? I ran, I will run. It's either in the past, all in the past, or it's in the future, somewhere in the future. Hebrew, it's pretty generally accepted, although you've got some crazy people who fought against this, but the vast majority of Hebrew scholars, they pretty much accept that Hebrew is based on a perfective system. So a verb is either complete or it is incomplete. Now, just so that we're clear, you can have an incomplete future action, obviously, right? I will build something. It hasn't been built yet. You can have an incomplete past action. I'm not going to try and express that grammatically, but I didn't do something in the past, right? It wasn't completed. You can have a past action that's complete. I built something. That was past, it's complete. You can have a future completed action. So just because something is complete does not declare in and of itself whether or not it is a past action or a future action. Why is that important? Because we have a perfective verb. I loved you. Now, are we talking about a past action? Is he saying, I have already loved you? Is this a present perfect, which you can have in English? I know, English grammar is awful. I have always loved you. Again, loved is perfect tense, right? Past tense. Future perfect. I will have loved you. Again, in all three sentences, which are technically accurate in English, loved is a perfect verb. So, is this past action? Is it present action? Is it future action? I can just go with the simple, yes, of course, this is all of the above. And when Hosea talks about when Israel was a child, I loved him, like from the very beginning. We have Jeremiah, who loves to talk about God's affection and lasting affection. So Hosea has framed it largely in the past. This is something that God has done and proven over and over again in the past. Jeremiah likes to frame it more in the present as something that will continue on in the future. So in terms of what are the prophets doing, they'll do everything. They'll do, the love is in the past, it's in the present, and it will continue on into the future. And this is well established. So all the way back in Deuteronomy, the Lord was devoted to you and chose you not because you were more numerous than all peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your fathers, right? So all of this is based on his love, affection for this people. Now, regardless of how this is supposed to be taken, right? Past, present, future, whatever, the question then, at least this is the response to God's statement, is, but you ask, how have you loved us? So forgive the meme, for those of you who don't even know what memes are, but I just can't help myself. That's all good, but what have you done for me lately? Don't tell me you haven't thought this. You read some verse in the Bible about how, God is faithful and God cares for you, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, yeah, but come on. What have you done lately? Don't look at me like that. You have all thought that. You have all had that thought. How have you demonstrated your affection in the last 24 seconds? But that's such a shallow answer. Like, well, you're breathing. It's like, like when the parent says, you should be grateful I continue to let you live. We have this kind of touched on, so with Zechariah, right? Where are your ancestors now? And do the prophets live forever? But didn't my words and my statutes that I commanded my servants, the prophets, overtake your ancestors? They repented and said, as the Lord of hosts proposed to deal with us for our ways and deeds, so has he dealt with us. So because you should remember, we've gone through all of these prophets. So Zechariah is pointing out, what happened to your ancestors? They were disobedient and God punished them. What's going on with you now? Right? Your ancestors have been punished. Now, again, when we are temporally does matter a bit, but he's talking to the present generation. They are back in the land. They're no longer in exile. And if we are past Haggai, Zechariah, which everyone agrees we are, the temple has been rebuilt, the symbol of God's presence, right? And if we're past Ezra, the wall has been rebuilt. Now, again, are we before Ezra, are we after Ezra? I'm not sure. But Jerusalem is in the process of being rebuilt. So they're asking, how do we really know that God does care for us? And kind of the response that Malachi is giving is, you're still alive. And that's not the parent saying, you're lucky that I let you live. He's saying, as a people, you are still together. God promised that if you're disobedient, I will take you out of the land, but I will bring you back as proof of my covenant with you. They are back in the land. This is proof that God still cares for them. The temple has been rebuilt as a symbol of his presence among his people. This should all be visual evidence that he still cares for them, right? This is physical proof. Not that it's ever enough. So, because I know you're all far more pious than I am, and just the question of, do you ever question God's affection would just completely ring hollow on your ears because you're just so much holier than I am. Without going to, because it's a great story, but I can't tell the story because you might know people involved, and then that would be bad. But again, without getting too deep into any details, because I just can't. It is a good story. It's one of my favorite stories, but I just can't tell it. For years, I was told that I was not going to be able to teach at Criswell. It was not going to happen. That there were too many barriers. There were just too many problems. It was not going to happen. I mean, I was straight up told, don't even bother to apply. It's not going to happen. That door is never going to open. And it was a little over 2 years ago, I was in the DTS library, pulling out my hair. That's a joke. I have no idea what's going to happen because I can't find a job. And I am desperate. And in the sense that I have prayed, look, if you want me to be a teacher, if this is really the direction you're leading me down, I need something. You got to open some door. DTS hasn't hired me. I've applied to all these schools. None of them have hired me. Something needs to happen. So I'm walking down the main aisle on the second floor of the DTS library. I remember this as clear as day. I turn the corner, and I practically knock over the vice president of Criswell College. And he seems rather startled that I just walked into him. I mean, it's something out of a bad rom-com. It was just ridiculous. Like, this is something that you would normally see like in a TV comedy. And he looks very startled, and he goes, James, you're here. I'm like, yes, I'm scrambling. I'm trying to get out of his way. He goes, no. He goes, do you have a minute? And I collected my thoughts just enough to say, for you, I have two. And he seemed to laugh at that. This is a guy who doesn't normally laugh. And he goes, step into my office. And by office, he meant one of the tables in the back. Now, this guy, again, he never makes jokes, but this was a very rare joke that he made. But to be fair, he was always in the library. Or at least, I'm being facetious, right? But he was very often in the library. So he takes me to one of the back tables, and I'm sitting across from him, and he leans over very intently, and I have no idea where this is going. And he says, James, give me a reason not to hire you. And I remember almost falling out of my chair against like something over-exaggerated, thinking, that's not normally how interviews go. right? Normally, it's give me a reason to hire you. And I remember very clearly the way he said it, give me a reason not to hire you. And I was just kind of flustered and said, I can't think of one. And there were other factors involved, but long story short, he hired me basically on the spot. Now, to be fair, school started in 3 weeks. He's like, okay, will you teach this fall? And I'm like, yes, I'll teach this fall. I had like less than 3 weeks to prepare. I can't explain how that happened. And all of the things, again, this is a very detailed with many, many moving parts. And even reflecting back on it, that all of these things had to happen is rather astonishing. And I am chief of skeptics when people say, oh, God made this happen. Like, okay, I mean, maybe, maybe not. I have no idea. This is something that I can't explain. That all of these things came to pass so that I would run into this guy and he would offer me a job. Now, back to this issue. That was 2 years ago. And I've been applying to other schools. This spring, was asked to lead a seminar for a school outside of Austin. I agreed to do it. And then I wasn't even told officially that they just canceled the seminar. I'm not getting paid. I put a lot of work into that too. I applied to teach at ABU over in Arlington. And then the person who vouched for me, who was a teacher over there, I won't publicly say his name, he just left with hardly any warning. And now I don't know if they're going to hire me. And I have thought, God, you opened a door for me 2 years ago. Where's the next door? And I get it, and you can judge me, just scowl at me. How dare you have that thought? I've had that thought. It's like, you helped me 2 years ago. It's been 2 years. It'd be nice if you opened another door. Adjunct teaching is great, but it's not a full-time job. So the point is, we do fall into this. At least I fall into this because I'm just a degenerate sinner, not as holy as everyone else. But here, clearly, Israel has having this problem, even though they're back in the land. The temple has been rebuilt. They are in the process of rebuilding the land, of rebuilding the city, and that should be enough to confirm for them that God is present and He cares for them. And yet, they still doubt. Because we still doubt, right? It doesn't matter how much God does for us, we still can doubt His presence and His affection. So, he's going to go into the argument. We're still in verse 1. He's going to go into the argument, right? Wasn't Esau Jacob's brother? Hopefully you remember this from when you were in Sunday school, unless you're Mr. Larry and you remember Esau. So, you've got Jacob and Esau. Of course, the story from Genesis, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 people will come from you and be separated, one greater than the other. Of course, we have the 2 nations, they go their separate ways. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau, and they are rivals to Israel. They are their brothers, but they're another people. We're told in Deuteronomy, for example, do not despise the Edomites because they are your brother, they're your brother nation. This is the Lord's declaration. Even so, I loved Jacob, but I hated Esau. And these are the words for love and hate. Now, we're not going to just beat this horse into the ground, but the word for love in Hebrew is ahav. The word for hate is shana. These are not the words that we use for love and hate. They're just not the same thing. They lack the deep emotional meaning that we attach to these words. These are more active ideas. Which is funny because we accept that the emotive words like love, hate, and so on do not have the same emotive weight that they do in English, except for the word fear. That just means fear, and to question that is just insanity. I have basically been told that by professors. Like, why would we say that about love and hate and not say that about fear? Just don't ask that question. Okay, that's a scientific thing to do, just not ask a question. Love here probably means accepted or chose. Hate probably means rejected or to dismiss. Again, probably not the emotional attachment that we put on it. Paul, of course, writes about this, talks about the distinction between Jacob and Esau, and he talks about God rejecting, hating Esau. But as we know, we're not just talking about the people themselves. In fact, the story of Jacob and Esau is my favorite story in the Old Testament. I love that story. But we're talking about the nation. As we know, the nation of Edom, right, the descendants of Esau, are one of the major opponents to the Jewish people, to Jerusalem, Israel, and Judah. And Edom is repeatedly indicted against. You've got Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all judging Edom and talking about the evils of Edom. We had the entire book of Obadiah talking about the judgment against Edom. And I've also talked about how I have my questions. Are we talking about, is Edom just the country, the physical descendants? Are we talking about Edom as representative on a national level? Or are we talking about the line of Cain? Is Edom becoming a symbol for this false line, right? We're talking about, you have the line of Seth that goes through Noah, Shem, and Jacob, and now we have the false line, right? The line of the covenant that goes up to and through Jacob versus the false covenant which goes up to and through Esau. It's possible. But the point, right? The point. I hated Esau. And by that, right, he's going to clarify what he means by that. I turned his mountains into a wasteland and gave his inheritance to the desert jackals. So Esau is wiped out. Not the person of Esau, and not necessarily even just his descendants, but the country, the nation, everything it represents has been destroyed. And we can talk about Romans, talking about how God can destine and intend things for destruction, like Esau. And when he says this, right, Paul is clearly referencing, drawing very heavily from Jeremiah, who Jeremiah in chapter 49 says, Edom will become a desolation. Everyone who passes by her will be horrified and scoff because of all of her wounds. So even Jeremiah talks about the destruction and the judgment of Edom. So verse 4, though Edom says, we have been devastated, but we will rebuild the ruins. The Lord of hosts says this, they may build, but I will demolish. They will be called a wicked country, and the people the Lord has cursed forever. So, Edom, in this setting, right, presumably sometime during the Babylonian captivity, their judgment, and now into the Persian period, Israel, Judah was wiped out, and at some point, Edom was also destroyed. The point that Malachi is making, right, is that you have two peoples, the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau. Both peoples, whether symbolically or whatever, both said, we are going to rebuild our countries. Which one is in the process of rebuilding? It's not Edom. It's not Esau. Judah is currently rebuilding. Verse 5. Your own eyes will see this, and you yourselves will say, the Lord is great, even beyond the borders of Israel. The fact that God has allowed and empowered you to rebuild when your brother country, right, I make the joke, like, your Bizarro to Superman, right, the false representative of Adam's line or whatever. You've got the false country of Edom. They are not rebuilding, and they will not rebuild because God has rejected them and said they're not going to rebuild. And this is proof, right, that God is not going to help them. He is going to help you. And we can talk about, he's not using the exact language, but what exactly is the purpose of miracles? And we've talked about plagues, wonders, and so on. And it stays pretty consistent. Whether we're talking about the plagues of Egypt or even the miracles of Jesus, the whole point of these miraculous signs is to show as proof the power of God and to verify the one who is speaking in God's name. They're rebuilding, which is something that shouldn't happen. Right? This is something that was said over and over again wouldn't happen. There were people, even when they were in the land, as we know from the books of Ezra and so on, who were scoffing and saying, why bother rebuild? Nothing's going to happen because of it. And yet, they are in the process of rebuilding. And the fact that they are allowed to rebuild, the fact that they are seeing this play out before them, should be proof, again, that God cares for them and loves them. And yet you still ask, how has God loved us? It's a very fitting question, and it's a very provocative question. And we do the same thing over and over again. So, second oracle, the unfaithful priests. Verse 6, a son honors his father, and a servant his master. This should be rather self-explanatory. I don't want to just frame this as, so we like to make this distinction between a slave-based economy versus some sort of capitalistic society. This is not really that. That's a really bad analogy. Because in a capitalistic society, a boss, well, the worker is a free economic agent. The boss has no obligation to care for you. And despite what you may have been raised or whatever you think or whatever, as soon as you enter the workforce, it should become abundantly clear your boss doesn't care about you. And in fact, the second it becomes economically disadvantageous, you will be removed, whether someone younger shows up or someone who will work for less or just robotics, right? They can just get rid of you in whatever way because the company doesn't care about its workers. That's just the way capitalism works. Now, in a slave-based society, for all of its evils, the owner, right, the master owns the slave, right? There is an obligation there. Okay, we can talk about the evils of slavery. I'm not dismissing that. But there is an ownership. You have responsibility, a legal responsibility for your property. Okay, you can abuse your property. I understand that. But there is this obligational relationship between the master and the servant, between the slave and the owner. Just like there is an obligatory relationship between a parent and child, right? That's why the connection is important. And this is something that we've seen all the way back in Exodus, but it's been repeated over and over and over again. Honor your father and your mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, this is one of the 10 commandments, right? Honor your parents. And the way they've explained it, and I think that it is right, I like the framing that in the 10 commandments, we basically have 10 topics, and that the legal material that follows is categorized according to the 10 commandments. So we have 10 categories all laid out by the commandments, and then we have these categories which kind of set the stage for all the various laws. So number 5 is honor your parents, which this is a foundational concept, which is basically you need to respect authority. And the way that this is established on the most fundamental level is, as children, you need to honor your parents. And as you get older, right, your relationship to those in power, it changes, it evolves. But just like a child should honor their parent, a slave should honor his master, and so on. You need to respect those that God has placed in authority over you. This is said over and over and over again throughout Scripture. But it starts in the home, it starts in the family. This is why it's so important, among other things, that you teach your kids to respect the parents, so that when they're older, they will respect those that have power over you, right? When they're pulled over by a police officer, they don't badmouth the police officer or say anything that might get them in trouble because you don't want to do that, right? You need to respect police officers. You need to respect judges and those who have political or economic power over you. Verse 6, so here we get our question. But if I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is your fear of me? I've heard it said that in the Bible we don't really see God framed as a fatherly figure. I don't know where that comes from. It is established. We see it over and over again. So God here frames himself as a father. We are his children, and so therefore we should respect him the way we respect our parents. And this is, from the very beginning, right? So in terms of the hierarchy, right, it begins on the most fundamental level. A child should respect their parent. And then we can kind of work our way up. As an adult, you should respect those in power over you, whether it's your boss or it's your leader, your governor, or whatever, those who have, again, some sort of authority. But at the very top level, there's God, and we're supposed to respect God if for no other reason than he holds power over us. It's a very basic concept. And here he's asking, Why don't we respect God? It's a good question. Why don't we respect him? And they go, well, what does that mean? Well, it's going to be explained. And he does mention right here, where is your fear? Again, this is going to be a theme, and I would argue it might be the dominant theme of Malachi. So we have seen this talked about. So when the storm appears and the sailors throw Jonah overboard, they are in awe of God. They have experienced God, and they have had a response of that fear. When Amos talks about the lion roaring and God bringing judgment, he asks the question, right? When the lion roars, when the judgment appears, shouldn't you be afraid? Almost like, shouldn't you respond in fear the way that the sailors did back in Jonah? And then Hosea talks about how we have no king. We don't respect kings. We don't respect any authority. And so, almost making the connection, right? Because there's no king, because we don't respect our king, we don't respect God, we don't fear God. So this is something that we've seen developed. We've seen explained and evolve as we've gone through, although we haven't really talked about it in too much detail. Verse 6. Says the Yahweh of hosts to your priests, who despise my name. So he asks, where is my respect? Where is my fear? And then he immediately connects this to, because you're like, well, how do you know we don't respect you? Because you don't respect my name. Now, we're going to get that clarified. What does it mean to not respect God's name? And some of you may be going, I respect the name of God. Again, we're going to get this clarified. We're going to explain what this means. But, honoring the name, that is also one of the 10 Commandments. And so we seem to be connecting these two, which I think is rather interesting. So honor your parents is number 5. That's the first. And so let's take a step back. Most people, and I think it's probably right, they lump the 10 Commandments into 2 categories. So we're breaking our way down. So you have the first 4, which are about loving God, right? Jesus says the greatest commandment, love God. And then we have the following 6, which are about taking care of our neighbors, right? Those who are not God, right? Our fellow humans. And Jesus says, right, the greatest commandment is love God. The second greatest commandment is love your neighbor. So we've got our cultic laws, right, our laws directed towards God, and we have our civil laws, those directed to our fellow man. Love God, love our fellow man. So he begins with, you don't honor your parents, or you don't honor me as a parent, so we're breaking the civil laws, at least I think it's kind of sort of alluded to. And then how do we know that? Well, because we don't honor God. And so now we're breaking both, right? We're breaking civil laws, we're breaking our cultic laws. Prophets like to do this. They like to kind of lump these together and do this sort of thing. It's rather clever. And just so, because this has been talked about, Micah back in 6:9, the voice of Yahweh calls out to the city, and it is wise to, we could say, fear, respect your name, pay attention to the rod and the one who ordained it, right? We're supposed to respect Yahweh, and we respect him by respecting his name, and part of that is by respecting those in authority. So this association is not new to Malachi, even though he's going to expand on this and elaborate. So we have this one kind of almost throwaway verse back in Micah, and now we're going to get a whole series of verses in Malachi elaborating on this one kind of verse. So verse 6. Yet you ask, how have we despised your name? I like the way Malachi kind of goes through all of this. So, he'll throw out a statement, and then we get the almost rhetorical question. Well, how have we done this? He'll explain. He's going to lay it out there. By presenting defiled food on my altar. Now, this is something that we have seen develop, right? This was an issue. This was an issue back in Amos, that they were offering, that they were making their offerings, right? They'd go to Sabbath or they would do whatever. They'd make their offerings when they're supposed to, and then they would go sin. And that didn't make God very happy. We have Hosea talking about how I desire loyalty and not sacrifices and so on. And then we also had Micah. What should I bring before the Lord when I come to bow before God on high? Should I come before him with burnt offerings with year-old calves? And the answer is no. That's not really what he wants. And of course, the verse that gets used over and over and over again, but it is relevant, is from Psalm 51. You do not want sacrifices, or I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offerings. Yes, we understand that. It's something that we've used over and over and over again. We get the context of it. Verse 7, you ask, how have we defiled you? And then we get the response. When you say the Lord's table is contemptible. When you present a blind animal for sacrifice, is it not wrong? And when you present a lame or sick animal, is it not wrong? Now this should be rather obvious. This should be blatantly obvious. So going all the way back to Deuteronomy, you must not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or sheep with a defect or any serious flaw. We won't go through all of them. You're welcome. But in Leviticus 22, we have all the descriptions and explanations for what a fitting sacrifice is. When you present your free will gifts or your vows as burnt offerings, you must offer an unblemished male from the cattle, sheep, goats, and they will be accepted. Do not present anything that has a defect because it will not be accepted. He goes on talking about if you offer anything that's blind or injured or maimed or that's festering, that God's not going to be very happy with you. When an ox, sheep, or goat is born, it must remain with its mother for 7 days. When you sacrifice a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice so that it may be acceptable, is to be eaten on the same day. So at the very end, you are to keep my commands and do them. I am Yahweh, you must not profane my holy name. I must be treated as holy among you Israelites. I am Yahweh, who sets you apart, the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh. So this seems rather important because, again, we're giving all these details. It's all explained. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and if you break this, God's not going to be very happy. He's taking it very personally, as we're finding out in Malachi. And just to kind of sum all this up, back in Exodus 23:19, bring the best of the first fruits of your land to the house of the Lord your God. And this probably, if we need one verse, this pretty much sums it up, right? When God wants his offerings, he wants the best, which is usually what we don't want to give up. There's a correlation to that. When we talk about why exactly God was unhappy with Cain, some people like to say, well, it was because God wanted a blood offering. He just wanted the lamb or whatever. But that dismisses the fact that the Israelites, the Hebrews, were not always required to give blood offerings. They could give fruit, they could give wine, they could give olive oil. It didn't always have to be a blood offering. That was usually on the part of sin, if you needed, as some sort of penalty. But if it's just a Thanksgiving offering, then yeah, you can give fruits or whatever. The important word, and it's in the Hebrew, is that Abel presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock. It's that qualifier. Abel is giving what was his best. And it seems like Cain was just giving whatever he had. It's like he didn't really take the time to make sure that he was giving the best that he had. And that's why God was angry with Cain. And then verse 8, bring it to your governor. Now this seems to be the smoking gun. Now we're back to beating the dead horse of when was this book written. Bring it to the governor. This is a word that we don't really see very often in the Old Testament. This is a Persian word. And this seems to be implying one of the Persian Empire is vast, it's enormous, and it's been broken up into districts. And each district has a regional governor. So it would make sense, since he used this word, that he is describing whoever the regional governor is for Judea, Palestine, whatever, that region of the Persian Empire. So logically, and it is a fair argument, this would have to be before Persia had given Israel its autonomy. So this would need to be before Ezra, because Ezra becomes the governor. So here's the argument, right? If Ezra or Nehemiah are currently the governors of Judea, why wouldn't he just say, take it to Ezra or take it to Nehemiah? Why use the term governor when he could have just said, give it to Nehemiah? Is it a definitive argument? Not necessarily, but again, this is the verse that people point to and say this has to be before Ezra came as governor. So just to let you know. But we have our Persian word, a Persian governor, and it's a rhetorical question. It's kind of an obscure. It's kind of an obvious question. If you are trying, so putting it in a more modern context, right? If you're trying to butter up your boss, right, for those who've seen the movie, your Chevy Chase in Christmas Vacation, and you really, really, really want that bonus, and you go because you need to smooze with your boss, and so you're bringing him a Christmas present because you want him to remember you, and you want him to remember you when he's signing those Christmas bonuses, right? Are you going to take him some cheap gift? Are you going to take him just whatever's lying around? No, you're probably going to take him a really nice gift because, again, you want to impress your boss. So the question is, if you're trying to impress whoever your leader is, your governor, are you going to just take him whatever? No, you're going to take him something really, really nice. And he goes, would he be pleased with you or show you favor? The answer is no, of course not. We know that. We understand that. And then the implied question is, why do we treat God that way? Why do we treat him as though we can just give him whatever we have or just give him our bare minimum and that this is going to be enough to impress him? And you can go, well, I don't treat God that way. I'm pretty sure we all treat God that way in one way or another or at one time or another. Verse 9, and now ask for God's favor. Will he be gracious to us? Since this has come from your hands, will he show any of you favor? Ask the Lord of hosts. So if you treat a human leader this way, the chances are they're not going to be very impressed. So if you treat God that way, is he going to be impressed? The answer, of course, is probably no. And we can compare this, right? Compare this to, because we're here at the very end, but compare it to Jonah, right? The very beginning. And we've got the judgment of God has come to Nineveh, and he's going to wipe out the Ninevites, and the king of Nineveh is, who knows? If we repent, if we do a genuine act of contrition, if we go over and beyond, right? They do this massive fast, a citywide fast. They refrain from bread. They refrain from water. Even the animals. They go completely beyond any requirement in the Old Testament to prove how sorry they are. And what does God do? He actually forgives them. They go over and beyond to prove how sorry they are, and God takes notice of that. It actually impressed him. And of course, the irony of this, and we see it over and over again, the prophets are like, look, God's going to wipe you out. But if you repent, who knows what might happen? Now, they never do. That's the whole thing. But if you try, maybe God will actually accept your contrition. Verse 10. And this is just an incredible verse. I wish one of you would shut the temple doors. So we know that this is after the rebuilding of the temple. So you would no longer kindle a useless fire on my altar. That is a statement. That God is so fed up with his people, I won't say us, but his people giving the bare minimum that he just goes, I wish you just wouldn't even bother opening the doors. That he is so, and this isn't even saying that they're not offering, they're not trying, but just the fact that they're going by doing the bare minimum, not doing what they're supposed to, not giving their best, is enough for him to say, just shut the doors. I am not pleased with you, says the Lord of hosts, and I will accept no offering from your hands. He's so fed up with this, he's so fed up with the bare minimum that he's just not even going to take them anymore. Verse 11, for my name will be great among the nations. From the rising of the sun to its setting, incense and pure offerings will be presented in my name in every place, because my name will be great among the nations, says Yahweh of hosts. Now, this is something that has been established. We've talked about this over and over and over again from Micah, right, who was writing during the Babylonian invasion, to Zechariah, who was writing during the rebuilding of the temple. This idea that God is going to be great, with or without his people's help. So this is nothing new, and this has been, again, a developing theme. And so Malachi is reminding them, God is going to be great. They can either, they can be part of the effort or they can be against it. Either way, this is going to happen. And this is not, again, this should not be anything new. This has been in the Bible, going all the way back to Deuteronomy. This statement, this assertion that God is going to establish himself and he is going to be known among the nations. And I've talked about this before, this sort of evangelistic nature of Israel, that the idea was to put Israel in the land and then to bless them to the point where all the other nations wanted what Israel had. The problem is Israel never lived up to that. You had maybe this brief moment under Solomon, which did not last, and then once Israel kind of finally turned from God, they just sort of became an example of his punishment, right? And now all the people are kind of, we don't want what Israel has because of the way that they're being treated. Verse 12, but you are profaning it, right? Profaning my name. That's what we're talking about. When you say the Lord's table is defiled and its product, its food is contemptible. You also say, look what a nuisance, and you scorn it, says the Lord of hosts. You bring stolen, lame, or sick animals. You bring this as an offering, and I am to accept that from your hands, asks the Lord. Now, we are not, so like we're talking about Israel. Sure we are. We're not at the tithe yet. I know that's in Malachi, but we're not talking about the tithe yet. We're talking about offerings. Now, we don't necessarily come to church bringing our goats and our sheep. I don't know if Brother Gary would appreciate that. I don't know. Maybe he would. Maybe Larry could bring a goat to church and offer it up to Gary as payment. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But all the same, we bring our offerings to the church. And again, the most obvious way we do that is with just money, and that is allowed. That is in the Old Testament. But I don't think that, at least here, we are exclusive to money. And I know that's just what we love to talk about. But we're just talking about our offerings in the most general sense. And can we honestly say that when we come, when we make our offerings, whether it's with money or time or whatever, that it is the best that we have to offer? Or are we just doing the bare minimum? We're not at the tithe yet, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to say some things that people aren't going to like. But very often we use the tithe as just the bare minimum. Well, that's what the Bible says, and that's what I'll give. I'm not sure that God's very happy with that. I mean, just as a... and I'm not always sure that it has to be 10%, but just the idea that, well, that's the bare minimum, that's what's required, that's what's commanded, and that's what I'll give, if I have to. That is not the right attitude. We're being told right here, he'd rather you just didn't give anything than just do the bare minimum and do it grudgingly. Again, we're not at the tithe yet. We're still just talking in very general terms, just very general, the offerings. The deceiver is cursed, and who has an acceptable male in his flock and makes a vow but sacrifices a defective animal to the Lord. For I am a great king, says Yahweh of hosts, and my name will be feared among the nations. So we've seen this as be kind of, if you have something to give, and you have something to give, and yes, that there is something that you could offer to God. Again, I'm not saying it's necessarily money and not necessarily an animal. Again, I don't think any of us raise animals like that. But you have something that you think God would like you to offer, and you don't. Or you give something of lesser value. He's not going to be very happy with that. And then, of course, all this is because his name, right? The whole thing was his name. He doesn't want us to misuse his name. And by misuse, he means, we've kind of gone down this rabbit trail. But what he means by that is he doesn't like us not doing our offerings, right? Not showing him the reverence that is due to him. And now we get to the end, he's like, his name, again, whether we like it or not, and whether we are not part of the program, his name is going to be feared, respected. And we've seen this built up. So we've seen this with Habakkuk, through Obadiah and Haggai, this idea that God is going to be feared. Again, you can be willing participants in this, or you can fight it, but either way, this is coming. Chapter 2, we're almost wrapping up. Therefore, this decree is for you priests. Oh, man. So we thought that he was mad with the people, and he is. But now he's going on the priests, because the priests are allowing it, encouraging it. They're just doing their jobs. And as I've said over and over again, I don't have my favorite slide from the book of James, but God holds priests, pastors, teachers to a very high standard. And here we've got priests who are facilitating the people not doing what they're supposed to. And he's now putting it on the priests. The priests aren't doing their jobs. If you don't listen and if you don't take it to heart to honor my name, says Yahweh of hosts, I will send a curse among you, and I will curse your blessings. In fact, I have already begun to curse them because you are not taking it to heart. Oh, man. What does this mean? So, I think Malachi, and I'm becoming more and more, I'll use the word radical in this, that I think Malachi is a rather important book for us. Because if we were to read Zechariah, and I know we're almost out of time, but if we were to read Zechariah and especially Ezekiel independently, we would be of the opinion that now that the temple is rebuilt, the Levitical line has been reestablished and God is happy with the Levites. And one of our problems with Ezekiel's temple and all of that is that God is going to bring back the sacrifices, he's going to bring back the priesthood. And what do we do with that? Because if you remember, right, the priests, they start with Levi, it goes through Aaron, we go through Nadab, Abihu, and so on. And we are now at Zadok. We're through with his line. What do we do with this, with the Zadokian line? Look, I am going to rebuke your descendants, so the line of Levi, and I will spread animal waste over your faces, the waste from your festival sacrifices, and you will be taken away with it. Then you will know that I sent you this decree so my covenant with Levi may continue, says the Lord of hosts. Okay, so he's going to rebuke the priests. He's going to, we just had with Zechariah the promise that the priesthood was being purified, and now he is going to unpurify them with waste. If this, it's in the Bible. If this upsets you or makes you a little, like, this shouldn't be in the Bible, Paul has some pretty strong things to say about waste and filth and human excrement and so on. So there's some very colorful and rather disgusting language in various places of the Bible. But verse 5, my covenant with him, presumably we're talking about Levi. Now all of a sudden we're talking about a covenant that God made with Levi, which is, as far as I know, never explicitly stated in the Torah, but we're talking about it as though there was one. My covenant with him was one of life and peace, and I gave these to him. It called for reverence, and he revered me and stood in awe of my name. So, this is what it called for, right? And then verse 6, true instruction was in his mouth. We're kind of buttering up Levi. Was Levi this great? I don't know. And nothing wrong was found on his lips. I wonder how Paul would have felt about this. He walked with me in peace and fairness and turned many from sin. This is the same Levi who built the golden calf, by the way. For the lips of a priest should guard knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth, because he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. This ideally is what the priest should be, especially the high priest, right? First of all, does this sound like Levi? Not really. And does this sound like the priests moving forward? Not really. In fact, God's been pretty angry with them, right? We've already gone through the priestly line, like Nadab, Abihu, and Abiathar. Like, we've had multiple priestly lines that have been disqualified or eradicated, and we're currently in a place where God's not very happy, it seems. Verse 8, you, on the other hand, have turned from the way. You have caused many to stumble by your instruction. We're talking about the current line of priests. The same priests that Zechariah just said were purified, that God was happy with them. Right? These are the ones coming out of the new high priest of Joshua. You have violated the covenant of Levi, says the Lord of hosts. So I, in turn, have made you despised and humiliated before all the people because you are not keeping my ways, but are showing partiality in your instruction. So he just said that he had made this covenant with Levi and had honored him and that he intended on keeping this covenant. But now we're told, and it seemed like this covenant, again, we don't get it spelled out in other places, but it seemed like under Zechariah that this covenant had been renewed under Joshua as the new high priest and this current line. They were purified and everything was going to be hunky-dory. However, as we know from Joel, everything wasn't hunky-dory, and the priests aren't doing a very good job. And now we're told from Malachi, it's as bad, if not worse. Now, again, are we pre-Ezra, are we post-Ezra? I don't know, but wherever we are, God is not happy with what's going on with these priests. In fact, they have violated, and perhaps they have, it seems like we're rather close to terminated the contract or the agreement that God made with Levi, which opens the door, and it seems like there are some conservative evangelical commentary theologians who do lean this way. So we know that someone is coming, back from Isaiah, who's going to teach and so on, and who is going to execute everything that God intended for the leaders of Israel. And we know that these various branches of power and authority are going to converge in some way, although it's not spelt out, and the priesthood is not explicitly mentioned here. But one thing, and I've mentioned this because we did go through Hebrews, and we're going to end on this, but if we read Ezekiel and Zechariah on their own, it sounds like God's rather okay with the Levitical line. In fact, he intends on maintaining the Levitical line. But we get to Hebrews, whoever the author is, and he lets us know that no, God is not happy with the Levitical line. He has been happy with them for a long time, and it was always his intention on getting rid of the Levites. Again, this seems like it's kind of coming out of left field. When did that happen, right? When is that spelt out that he's thinking about or contemplating the removal of the Levitical priesthood? And I think it might be here in Malachi. Again, now we're getting this description of the covenant of Levi, and God having elevated Levi and made all these promises with Levi, and has repeatedly tried to purify or prune this line, and even tried to restore it on multiple occasions, and finally it's at the point where the covenant has basically been broken. So then, where do we move forward? It seems like that at least is opening the door for maybe it's time for a new priestly line. So just to kind of wrap up that, God is not happy with the current priesthood. We will end there. I'll ask Mr. Larry, would you like to close us in prayer?